A lot to dig into here. Let's start off with NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, New York Times national security and Pentagon correspondent Helene Cooper. She's also an MSNBC political contributor. And we've got former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author of The Briefing Book Substack, Joel Rubin. Gabe, I want to start with you at the White House. Where do things stand this morning? And what did we hear from the president? Specifically, the complexities of his relationship with Putin were on display both yesterday at the White House, but definitely in his phoner on Fox News this morning.
Oh, yes, Ali, certainly a very complex relationship. And look, this morning, the Trump administration is actively working to hammer out those details of that meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy. Still, though, a lot of unanswered questions at this point. We don't have any potential time or location, although the president is indicating that he wants this meeting to happen soon. But at this point, Ali, look, the president, not always a very detail-oriented person. What he wants is he wants to be able to say that he is the person that got these two leaders in a room when his predecessor, President Biden, could not. And so that is what the administration is hanging its hat on this morning. And yes, you're right. The president interviewed on Fox News earlier today talking about his relationship with Vladimir Putin. Let's listen to some of that.
I thought I'd do first let them meet. You know, they haven't been exactly best friends. They haven't gotten along very well. And I called President Putin yesterday, and I do have a good relationship. But it, only matters if we get things done. Otherwise, I don't care about the relationship. So we're setting up a meeting. I sort of set it up with Putin and Zelenskyy, and they're the ones that have to call the shots.
So the president also saying that he called President Putin yesterday without the European leaders in the room as a sign of respect. Also, another point that I should mention, Ali, in that interview, President Trump also making an assurance that there would be no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. That is significant because yesterday he was asked about this twice. He didn't say one way or the other, but he didn't rule out that there could be some sort of U.S. peacekeeping force in Ukraine. However, now it's clear that he anticipates that being something that the Europeans do, and the U.S. Just kind of hangs back or at least coordinates it out.
Yeah, it's actually a really important detail that the president filled in this morning, Gabe. Thank you for pointing that one out. But, Joel, I think there's the bilateral piece of this between Zelenskyy and Putin. That, of course, carries a lot of risks, potentially a high reward, but I want you to get into that. And then the other piece of this is once you get through the bilateral, in theory, you're going to a trilateral where Trump is one of the arbiters in the room. But after you watched European leaders flood to the White House, in large part because I think they wanted to make sure they knew how Trump was maneuvering here, what does that say about the role that the U.S. could play once we get to, and if we get to, that trilateral point?
Yeah, Ali, you've laid it out exactly right. Look, yesterday was photo op diplomacy, and I fear it's flip-flop diplomacy. It seems like every day there's a different vision that President Trump wants to put out there, depending upon who he speaks with last today. Fox News, meaning, oh, no, I'm not going to put American troops at risk. Well, what's the point of security guarantees then? If you're Ukrainian, you hear that and you think Budapest Agreement, other past agreements that did not hold when Russia invaded. So the idea of putting these two men in the room, it's a photo op idea. We need a diplomatic end state. But if you don't bring Vladimir Putin to the table where he's truly ready to make concessions, it's a useless exercise. And in fact, it would set back a lot of the international work to try to stop this war.
I do think that's one of the pitfalls as we look ahead to this. And again, there's no clear timeline on when that tete-a-tete would actually happen. There's no firm location, though in an interview with Andrea Mitchell, one of the European leaders floated that maybe it could be Geneva, again, getting ahead of where we actually are in terms of firm details. But Helene, one of the things that is being talked about right now is the role of a ceasefire. The Europeans haven't ruled it out. Trump is pushing ahead without it. But these next steps are going to take weeks of planning and coordination, and the killing will continue. So at what point do they face a fork in the road about Putin delaying consequences, Helene?
Well, that's the crux of this, Ali. I mean, just last night, Russia lobbed 270 drones and 10 missile attacks at Ukraine. The killing and the Russian attacks in Ukraine could continue, and that's why everybody has been so focused on getting a ceasefire. And that's exactly why Russia doesn't want a ceasefire as well, because that turns it flips everything and takes it away from Vladimir Putin's favor. President Trump, before he went to Alaska to the summit, was pushing for a ceasefire. He saw Vladimir Putin in Alaska and he dropped that. And you saw some of the European leaders, including Friedrich Merz of Germany yesterday, still sort of clinging on to the ceasefire hope. But President Trump appears to be sailing on without that. And that's if you are Ukraine, this is exactly where you don't want to be, because it's these cities and towns in Ukraine, particularly in eastern Ukraine, that are getting pummeled now, and it's Ukrainians who are dying, especially when President Trump has been so vague about these security guarantees. And security guarantees, I can't stress how important that is to all of this. If you're Ukraine, you want the security guarantees, but you want them backed up by the United States. And President Trump has been so vague about that. Everybody's clinging on to, he didn't rule out American troops. Well, now he has. He hasn't said what role the U.S. would have in this. And that, again, is sort of like where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, that's also where the malleable posture, we'll say, I think really comes into play from the point of view of the White House. Helene, as you were talking, Joel was here nodding his head along, especially when you made the point about meeting with Putin and then the ceasefire falling off the table. So, Joel, I leave that to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, the president, he claims that he wants a ceasefire, then he doesn't. What got even Putin to the point of discussing this was the possibility of more sanctions. Now he doesn't want more sanctions. And there are 90 senators who have co-sponsored new sanctions legislation.
You never
to place
get that on the Hill anymore.
It's impossible to get 90 senators unified in one piece of legislation in the middle of a hot war, no less. So, the president's kind of a wet noodle right now. He is trying to see what sticks. I think he saw, and we may have seen yesterday, that he knows the road to a Nobel Peace Prize goes through Europe. So he wants these European leaders on his side. And so we don't really have a clear vision on how to end this war. And the United States is not putting the kind of requisite pressure into the mix that we need to get Vladimir Putin to legitimately make concessions.
Yeah, I do think that there's a clarity from people like Macron about the consequences, whether they be primary sanctions, secondary sanctions on Russia if this deal does not come together. But Trump was asked multiple times yesterday, Gabe, about the prospect of would there be severe consequences still if ceasefires are not upheld and if Putin doesn't come to the table. So that's one piece of it. But I think it also factors into what we've been talking about, a lot of made-for-TV moments, which means what comes with that is the potential for hot mic moments. And that is exactly what happened yesterday when the president was speaking with French President Macron. Gabe, can you take us through that moment and why it matters so much, the way that Trump is talking about the Russian president here?
Yeah, certainly, Ali. And look, first of all, to your point on the president backing off these serious consequences for Russia, it was just a couple days ago, just less than a week ago, really, when he was directly asked that question. And even on Friday, en route to that summit in Alaska, saying you were very disappointed if there wasn't a ceasefire. And just several days before, here in Washington at the Kennedy Center, saying that there would be very serious consequences for Russia if there was no ceasefire. He seems to have completely backed off of that. But to your point on this hot mic moment, it happened yesterday. Let's take a listen to it. It's when the president was speaking with the French President Macron yesterday here at the White House. Let's listen to that first and talk on the other side.
I think he wants to make a deal. I think he wants to make a deal for me. You understand that, as crazy as it sounds?
And, Ali, that's very significant. I think he wants to make a deal for me.
Yeah.
There have been many national security analysts that look at that and say, look, Vladimir Putin wants to make a deal for himself, not for President Trump. But I think it's very interesting to see how the president is thinking about this, thinking that personal relationship with Vladimir Putin might eventually end up with the deal. Now, I will mention my colleague Kristen Welker. She did speak with Emmanuel Macron, got his reaction to that, the French president saying that he thinks it's great news that President Trump feels that he has the capacity to get this deal done, but also injecting some skepticism there and saying that any ceasefire deal or any peace deal would have to work for not just Ukraine, but also for Europe, Ali.
skepticism from Macron, and he's outright called himself a pessimist in that interview with Welker. I think, Helene, one of the key pieces of whether the optimists or the pessimists will win the day actually come when it comes into the security guarantee issue. I want you to listen to what leaders were saying about the U.S. role yesterday, and we'll talk on the other side.
It's a very important progress of the past few days that your president expressed a clear commitment of the U.S. to be part of the security guarantees. It's brand new.
That's 30 countries already working together on security guarantees. We'll now work with the U.S. on those guarantees, coordinating.
What we have agreed on is to work on European and American security guarantees, essentially which will be secure from the European perspective, coordinated with the Americans.
What security guarantees do you need from President Trump to be able to make a deal? Is it American troops, intelligence, equipment? What is it?
Everything.
Everything's probably not on the table here, but we don't know what the U.S. role is actually going to look like, though we've heard the phrase Article 5-like protections. Why would Putin go along with any of that kind of arrangement, Helene? And ultimately, does it matter? Some European leaders have said, that's fine, Putin doesn't need to get on board with it, but he kind of does if you look at the way Trump's looking at this.
Look, one of the whole reasons why Putin went into Ukraine to begin with is he was getting tired of an encroaching NATO just getting too close to his borders. So you have to ask yourself, you know, this question of why would Russia go along then with NATO troops inside Ukraine? That's a whole lot closer to the Russian border than they were before the war started. That said, that's kind of what Zelenskyy is looking for. There are ways around this problem. There are ways that the U.S. could join. You could put American troops in neighboring NATO countries that are close to the Ukraine border and then have European troops inside of Ukraine. This is not outside the will of diplomats to figure out a way out of this. But but when you ask yourself, why would Russia go along with this? What is Russia going to, because if you have the kind of security guarantees that Ukraine wants, it's hard to see how Vladimir Putin could at any point sell this to his people as a win for Russia if you've got NATO troops that much closer to the Russian border. So I don't know. I'm not a diplomat.
Joel, what do you see in this?
Well, Ali, I keep on thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had a multilateral security institution in the heart of Europe that would guarantee security for all of its members? Oh,
Wouldn't it be?
Wouldn't it be? Wait, we've got one. It's called NATO. Use what you got. Why settle for the imitation when you can get the real thing, to paraphrase Walter White? Why have Diet Coke when you can get the classic? And I just think this dancing on the pin's head of a needle here is just ridiculous. And the United States, we have our NATO allies there. That is what Putin fears. That is another lever that we can use to get a diplomatic agreement. All this dancing around other mechanisms only strengthens Putin's negotiating hand.
Yeah, look, you make a great point that they have made clear NATO-like has been the phrase that we've continued to hear used, but at the same time, you could just do NATO, though Trump has taken that off the table and said that is not an option for Ukraine, at least at this point. A lot for us to continue to keep track of, but all of you, thank you for such a robust conversation, really setting us up. Gabe, Helene, and Joel, thank you, as always.